"Take the trash out." That's what he called us. Not my father or my daughter. Just trash. I remember the way the crystal chandelier above the dining table vibrated when he slammed his fist down. The sound of gold-trimmed porcelain shattering against the mahogany was the last thing I heard before the freezing Oregon air hit my face. My name is Harper Carter, and on that Christmas night, I learned that blood doesn't make you family. It just gives people a closer target to hit. The dinner had started with a lie, like it always did. My father, Thomas Carter, was holding court, sipping a 30-year-old scotch and bragging about a merger that didn't exist yet. The guests, men in stiff suits and women with frozen, Botoxed smiles, nodded like bobbleheads. I sat there, invisible as usual, my hand resting on Grandpa George's wheelchair. Grandpa was the only reason I stayed in that house. He was a shadow of the man he once was, his hands trembling with a Parkinson's tremor that the doctor said was exacerbated by stress. Then it happened. A single, tiny piece of turkey slipped from Grandpa's fork. It landed on the silk tablecloth, a small, greasy stain on a sea of perfect white. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. My father stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the stain, then at Grandpa's shaking hand, then at me. His face didn't turn red. It turned white, the color of a dead thing. He didn't see a father who had raised him. He saw a defect, a smudge on his brand. "I told you to keep him under control, Harper," he said, his voice a low, jagged blade. "Dad, it was an accident." "He's tired," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply stood up, grabbed the back of the wheelchair, and shoved it toward the foyer. I ran after them, tripping over my own heels, screaming for him to stop. He threw open the heavy oak doors, and the blizzard outside roared in like a physical blow. With one final violent shove, he pushed the wheelchair onto the icy porch. Then he grabbed my arm, the grip leaving bruises I'd carry for weeks, and flung me out after him. "Don't come back until you've cleaned up your act, both of you," he snarled. The door slammed, the lock clicked. And just like that, the Carter mansion became a fortress of glass and gold, and we were outside in the dark. I didn't feel the cold for the first 10 minutes. Adrenaline is a powerful insulator. I just stood there, staring at the frosted glass of the dining room window. I could see the silhouettes of the guests. They were still sitting there. Someone laughed. Someone raised a glass. No one came to the door. No one called out. Grandpa George was shivering so hard, the wheelchair was rattling against the pavement. Harper, I'm so sorry," he wheezed. His breath was coming out in thin, ragged plumes of white. "Don't you dare apologize, Grandpa," I said, my voice cracking. I stripped off my thin evening wrap and tucked it around his legs, though it did nothing against the sub-zero wind. We had no car. My father had allowed me to drive one of his, but the keys were inside. We had no phones. Mine was sitting on the dining table next to a half-eaten salad. All I had was the $20 tucked into my shoe for emergencies and the sheer burning spite in my chest. I pushed that wheelchair for 2 miles through the slush of Portland. My toes went numb, then they burned, then they felt like lead. We reached my tiny apartment on Hawthorne Street, a place my father called a hovel and refused to visit. It was a 3rd-floor walk-up with a broken elevator. I had to carry Grandpa, his frail body weighing almost nothing, up 62 stairs while a neighbor's dog barked incessantly. When we finally got inside, I turned the dial on the radiator. It clanked, hissed, and stayed cold. I looked around my room. The peeling wallpaper, the single window that rattled in the wind, the smell of old wood and cheap coffee. This was it. This was the trash bin my father had consigned us to. I sat on the floor and cried, and not because we were poor, I'd been poor in spirit for years in that mansion, but because I realized that the man I called Dad would literally let his own father freeze to death for a stain on a tablecloth. January was a blur of gray slush and exhaustion. To survive, I took every shift available. I started at 5 a.m. at the Rusty Spoon Diner, serving greasy eggs to truckers who didn't look me in the eye. My hands, which used to spend hours playing piano in the Carter drawing room, were now red and raw from industrial-strength dish soap. Every day was a rhythmic torture: scrub, rinse, dry, repeat, order up, coffee refill, smile through the fatigue, repeat. By 2 p.m., I'd sprint 3 blocks to the local supermarket to stock shelves until midnight. I became a ghost. I moved through the aisles like a shadow. Up my mind repeating the same calculation. Rent is $800. Grandpa's meds are $250. Food is whatever is left. Grandpa George watched me from the corner of our one-room apartment. He stayed in that wheelchair most of the day, his eyes following me with a look of profound, silent agony. He tried to help. He'd try to fold the laundry, but his hands would shake so much he'd drop the clothes, and I'd find him crying quietly when I got home. "I'm a burden, Harper," he whispered one night as I was rubbing ointment into his swollen ankles. "You should put me in a state home. You could go back. He'd take you back if I wasn't here." I stopped rubbing and looked him dead in the eye. "If you ever say that again, George Carter, I will be very angry. You are the only person who ever saw me, not the Carter heiress, just Harper. We are in this together." As I sat there in the dim light of a flickering 40-watt bulb, my mind drifted back. People think the Carters were always cold. But I remember a time, maybe 15 years ago, when we went to a cabin in the Cascades. I remember my father laughing as he chased me through the pines. I remember Grandpa George sitting on the porch sketching the mountains. What happened? When did the money stop being a tool and start being a god? I remember the day it shifted. My father had lost a major contract. He came home and threw a vase, a Ming Dynasty piece Grandpa loved, at the wall. Grandpa didn't yell. He just picked up the pieces and said, "Thomas, if you value the vase more than the piece of this house, you've already lost your fortune." My father never spoke to him the Kung way again. That was the beginning of the end. The greed had started like a rot, invisible at first, until the whole structure was hollow. One Sunday morning, the air in Portland felt different. The rain had stopped, and a thin, pale sun was trying to break through the clouds. I was in the kitchenette, boiling water for the cheapest tea I could find, when Grandpa George spoke. His voice wasn't shaking. It was deep. It sounded like the man from the sketches. "Harper," he said, "do you still have that old beat-up Honda your friend sold you?" "Yeah, Grandpa. It barely starts, but it runs." "Why?" "I want you to drive me somewhere, not to the clinic, not to the park." He looked at me, and for the first time I noticed he wasn't looking at the peeling wallpaper. He was looking through it. "I want you to take me to the Iron Gate on Skyline Drive." My heart skipped. Skyline Drive was where the old money lived, the people who looked down even on my father. "Grandpa, we can't go there. We'll be trespassed." "Just drive, Harper," he said, a faint, mysterious smile playing on his lips. "It's time we stopped living like guests in our own lives." I didn't know it then, but as I helped him into that rusted car, we weren't just going for a drive. We were going to reclaim a ghost, and that ghost was worth more than my father could ever imagine. I used to think my father's house was a palace. I grew up among marble pillars and vaulted ceilings, thinking that was the peak of human achievement. I was wrong. As I drove my rusted, clanking Honda up Skyline Drive, the trees seemed to grow taller, the air thinner and more expensive. Grandpa George sat beside me, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't spoken a word since we left the apartment. He just stared ahead with an intensity I'd never seen, the gaze of a king returning from exile. Then we saw it, the Iron Gate. It wasn't just a gate, it was a barrier between worlds, massive black wrought iron, twisted into the shapes of lions and vines. No address, no name, just a gold C entwined with an L at the center. "Grandpa, we shouldn't be here," I whispered, my foot hovering over the brake. "The security alone." "Keep driving, Harper," he said softly. As the car approached, I expected sirens. I expected men with dogs. Instead, the heavy gates groaned and swung open as if the earth itself were welcoming us. Two men in charcoal gray suits stepped out of a stone guardhouse. They didn't reach for weapons. They didn't ask for ID. They bowed, deeply. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter," one of them said, his voice echoing in the quiet morning. "It has been far too long." My jaw dropped. "Grandpa? What? How do they know you?" He didn't look at me. He just placed a trembling hand on the dashboard. "Drive on, sweetheart. The truth is at the end of this road." The driveway was nearly a mile long, lined with ancient oaks that formed a natural cathedral over the path. And then the house appeared. It wasn't a house. It was a masterpiece of stone, glass, and light. It sat on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the entire Willamette Valley. When I helped Grandpa into his wheelchair, the front doors, 20 feet of solid walnut, swung open. A woman in a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back in a silver bun, rushed down the steps. She looked like she had been waiting 20 years for this moment. "Master George," she choked out, her eyes brimming with tears. "The staff, we never stopped maintaining it. Just as you ordered." "Thank you, Elena," Grandpa said, his voice regaining a resonance I hadn't heard in years. "This is Harper, my granddaughter, my only heir." I felt like I was floating. Elena looked at me with a mix of reverence and pity. "It is an honor, Miss Harper. Please come inside." The interior was a sensory overload. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen galaxies from the ceiling. The floors were white Mikael marble, so polished I could see my own exhausted, tear-streaked face reflecting back at me. But what struck me most wasn't the wealth. It was the silence. It was a house built for a family that had vanished. Grandpa led me to a massive library. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, smelling of old paper and expensive tobacco. He pointed to a large mahogany desk. "Sit, Harper. We need to talk about why your father is the man he is." I sat, my hands shaking. Grandpa opened a hidden wall safe, not with a key, but with a thumbprint. He pulled out a thick black leather folder. "40 years ago, I didn't just build a company," he began. "I built a shadow. Everyone knows Carter Estates Group, the company your father runs. But they don't know that I saw the rot in Thomas before he even finished college. I saw the greed. I saw the way he looked at people as tools, not humans." He paused, a shadow of pain crossing his face. "The night of my accident, the car crash that put me in this chair, I never told anyone this, Harper, not even the police. Because the car that hit me, I recognized the driver. It was a man who worked for your father's private security firm." I felt sick, my stomach twisted into a cold knot. You think Dad tried to kill you?" "I don't think. I know," he whispered. "But he was sloppy. He thought by crippling me, he could take the company. He didn't realize that I had already moved 90% of my personal wealth into a separate entity. A company he couldn't touch. A company called Legacy Holdings." He slid the folder across the desk. I opened it. My eyes blurred as I scanned the numbers. Real estate in Manhattan, timberlands in Brazil, tech shares, resorts in Switzerland, and at the bottom, a single finalized figure from a Swiss audit. $2,301,450,000. "I lived in that apartment with you, Harper, because I needed to know," he said, his voice breaking. "I needed to see if the Carter bloodline was completely poisoned. I waited. I watched your father throw us into the snow, and I watched you. I watched you work 3 jobs, stock shelves until your fingers bled, and feed me before you fed yourself." He reached out and took my hand. His skin was like parchment, but his grip was iron. "You passed the test I never wanted to give you. This isn't just money, Harper. It's a weapon. And tonight, we're going to use it." He handed me a second folder. This one was red. "The black folder is the will. It makes you the richest woman in this state. The red folder, that's the evidence. It contains every forged document, every illegal bank transfer, and every recording of your father's crimes over the last 2 decades. I've been a silent ghost in his system, recording everything." He looked at me with a terrifying clarity. You have a choice. You can take the money and walk away. You can live a life of luxury and never see Thomas Carter again. Or you can go back to that mansion. You can show him what he threw away, and you can burn his world to the ground. I looked at my hands. They were still stained with the ink from the supermarket price gun. I felt the bruise on my arm where my father had gripped me. I heard the sound of his laughter while we froze on the porch. I don't want the luxury, I said, my voice sounding like someone else's, someone older, colder. I want justice. 2 hours later, I wasn't the girl in the rusted Honda. I was in the back of a black Bentley wearing a tailored charcoal suit that Elena had kept in storage for the future Mrs. Carter. We pulled up to my father's mansion, the same gates, the same lights, but this time I didn't ring the bell. I had the master key code, one my father thought he had changed, but Grandpa George had never lost access to. I walked into the living room. It was another party, another night of whiskey and lies. My father was standing by the fireplace, his arm around Lydia, laughing at a joke a senator had just made. He saw me. He froze. The glass in his hand tilted, my amber liquid dripping onto the rug. "Harper," he sneered, recovering his arrogance, "I thought I told you not to come back until you were ready to apologize for that old man's mess. And where did you get that suit? Did you steal it?" Lydia giggled, a sharp, metallic sound. Maybe she found a new sugar grandpa to take care of her. I didn't flinch. I walked to the center of the room, the heels of my boots clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. The room went silent. The power dynamic shifted so fast it was almost physical. "I'm not here to apologize, Thomas," I said. I didn't call him Dad. That word died in the snow. I set the briefcase on the table and snapped the latches. The sound was like a gunshot. "I'm here to give you a choice, and unlike you, I'm going to give you more mercy than you deserve." I pulled out the red folder. "This is your life, Thomas. Every crime, every lie, every cent you stole from the man who gave you life." His face went from pale to ashen. He reached for the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it. "Don't! You don't get to touch this. Not yet. Because before we talk about the prison cell waiting for you, we need to talk about the $2.3 billion you just threw into the street." The silence was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. I could hear Lydia's ragged breathing. "What? What are you talking about?" Thomas stammered. "That old man doesn't have a dime. I stripped him of everything." "You stripped him of the company you thought he had," I said, leaning in until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. But Grandpa George was always 10 steps ahead of a man like you. He built an empire while you were busy playing king in a cardboard castle." I slid the black folder toward him. Just the cover page. When he saw the figure, the $2 billion, his knees actually buckled. He had to grab the mantle to keep from falling. "No," he whispered. "No, that's impossible. It's mine. I'm the son. I'm the only heir." "You were the son," I corrected. "Now, you're just the man who called a billionaire trash and threw her out in a blizzard." I turned to the guests who were staring in horrified fascination. "The party is over," I announced. "Get out, all of you. This house is being liquidated tomorrow morning." Thomas looked at me, and for the first time in 28 years, I saw it. The fear. The pure, an unadulterated terror of a man who realized he hadn't just lost a daughter, he had created an enemy who owned everything he ever wanted. "Harper, baby, let's talk about this," he started, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I just picked up my briefcase, turned my back on him, and walked toward the door. "See you in court, Thomas. They say the walls have ears, but in my father's house, the walls had cameras, microphones, and 20 years of digital ghosts." 3 days after I walked out of that mansion, the world broke for Thomas Carter. It started at 6 a.m., a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the fog hangs heavy over Portland, hiding the sins of the city. I was standing on the balcony of Grandpa's new library, watching the convoy of black SUVs wind their way up the driveway of my father's estate on the opposite hill. Through high-powered binoculars, I watched the front door, the same door that had slammed behind me in the snow, get kicked off its hinges. FBI, IRS, SEC. A symphony of alphabet agencies coming to collect a debt that had been compounding for decades. I saw my father being led out in his silk pajamas, no tie, no cufflinks, no dignity. He looked small. For the first time in my life, the giant who had haunted my nightmares looked like a terrified child. Lydia was right behind him, screaming at the cameras, her designer robe fluttering in the wind like a white flag of surrender. The courtroom felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. My father sat at the defense table, his hair thinning, his face a map of gray lines. He refused to look at me. But he couldn't stop looking at Grandpa George. Grandpa sat in his wheelchair in the front row, his back straighter than it had been in years. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which is a much heavier thing to carry. The prosecution played the tapes. "The old man needs to disappear, Thomas. He's a liability," a voice hissed from the speakers. "It was Lydia." "I know," my father's recorded voice replied, cold as a winter grave. "If the crash didn't finish him, the neglect will. Just make sure the documents are signed before he loses his mind completely." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The jurors looked at Thomas with a disgust so visceral it felt like a physical heat. My father's lawyer tried to argue mental distress and corporate pressure. He tried to paint me as a vengeful daughter. But then, the prosecutor called the final witness. I called George Carter to the stand. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Grandpa didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at his son. "Thomas," Grandpa said, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had built empires from nothing. "I didn't give you a company. I gave you a name. And you dragged it through the mud of your own greed. You thought wealth was about what you could take. I tried to teach you it was about what you could give." "Dad, please," Thomas whispered, his first display of genuine emotion. "Don't dad me," Grandpa cut him off, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp grief. "You threw your own child into a blizzard on Christmas. You left your father to die for a turkey stain. You didn't just lose your fortune today, Thomas. You lost your soul, and that is a sentence no judge can mitigate." The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty on all counts. Racketeering, forgery. Attempted murder via gross negligence, 22 years. As the bailiffs led him away, Thomas finally looked at me. His eyes were wide, pleading. For a split second I felt that old tug, the desire for a father's love. But then I remembered the smell of the exhaust from his car as he drove away from the curb on Hawthorne Street, while I shivered in the slush. I turned my back. I didn't watch him go. Justice is a cold meal. It fills the stomach, but it doesn't warm the heart. 6 months later, the spring roses were in full bloom at the Legacy estate. Grandpa George's health had declined rapidly after the trial. The doctors said his will to live had finally achieved its purpose. He had seen the truth told. He had seen me safe. I was sitting by his bed, reading him his favorite book, A History of Oregon's First Timber Mills. He reached out, his hand feeling like a dry leaf against mine. "Harper," he whispered. "I'm here, Grandpa." "The money. It's a heavy cloak. Don't let it smother you. Wear it to keep others warm." "I will. I promise." "And Harper?" He smiled, a faint, beautiful light in his fading eyes. "You were always the best thing the Carter name ever produced. Not the buildings, not the billions. Just you." He passed away that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the valley into a sea of gold. He went out like a king, surrounded by the love he had earned, while his son sat in a concrete cell, surrounded by the ghosts of his own greed. I didn't keep the mansion on the hill. I sold it and donated every cent to the Portland Homeless Coalition, specifically for family shelters. My father's castle now houses the people he once called trash. I renamed the holdings to Carter Legacy Group. We don't build luxury condos for billionaires anymore. We build sustainable housing. We fund scholarships for kids who have to work 3 jobs just to survive. I'm standing on the stage now, looking at 500 students who are holding the same George Carter scholarship I created. My husband, Ethan, is in the front row, holding our son, Henry. Last Christmas, I say into the microphone, my voice steady and clear, I thought the coldest thing I'd ever feel was a Portland winter. I was wrong. I look at the giant portrait of Grandpa George hanging behind me. The coldest thing is a heart without empathy. But today, looking at all of you, I realize that even the deepest winter can be broken by a single spark of kindness. My grandfather didn't leave me $2.3 billion. He left me a responsibility. He taught me that your worth isn't measured by what's in your bank account, but by how many people feel safer because you exist. I smile, and for the first time the cold is completely gone. Welcome to the family. Let's build something that lasts. If this story touched you, remember that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Don't be a Thomas. Be a Harper. Like this video if you believe character matters more than blood, and subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption. Comment below, what would you do if you discovered a secret worth $2.3 billion?